My brother stole our dad's $40,000 life insurance payout. He said, I needed it more. I found proof he lied about the funeral costs and got him disowned. My dad wasn't a man of extravagance. He lived a simple life, worked hard, saved what he could, and never really bought anything fancy. Growing up, he was strict but fair, and we always knew he'd be there for us, no matter what. My mom, too. They worked together to make sure we had what we needed, and Dad always taught us the value of hard work. I never thought my older brother, Ray, would take advantage of that trust, of all things. But then Dad passed away last year, and Ray's true colors came out in a way I could have never predicted. When Dad died, it hit all of us hard. Losing a parent is something you're never fully prepared for, and everything felt like a whirlwind. The shock, the grief, the immediate need for funeral arrangements, it was like a storm. Ray, being the oldest and a natural talker, volunteered to handle everything. He said he'd take care of the funeral arrangements, sort out the bills, handle Dad's affairs. Mom and I were too exhausted to argue. Ray had always been quick with decisions, good at talking people into things, and somehow, it just made sense to let him take over. That's when things started feeling off. Dad had a $40,000 life insurance policy, something he'd told us about once when we were kids. He always said, it's for you and your mom, to take care of things if I go first. That policy was meant to cover the funeral, keep Mom comfortable for a while, and maybe even give a little cushion for any other needs that came up. Ray knew about that insurance money too. The day after Dad passed, Ray told us he'd made some calls and that it was enough to cover a good service for Dad, something worthy of his memory. I wasn't really thinking clearly, so I didn't question him. I just assumed he was right, but over the next few weeks, Ray started dropping hints that he was shelling out a lot of cash for the arrangements, that funerals were way more expensive than they seem. I didn't know what to believe, but something didn't sit right. I brushed it off as grief, telling myself he was probably just stressed. Then, a few days after the funeral, Ray mentioned how expensive the service had been. He said he'd nearly used up all the insurance money, that there'd been extra costs because Dad deserved nothing but the best. He even claimed he'd put in some of his own savings to cover everything. The way he talked about it, he made it seem like he'd gone out of his way, like he'd gone above and beyond to make sure Dad's memory was honored. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But it felt strange, the way he kept emphasizing the costs. Weeks turned into months. Ray stopped mentioning the money, and I tried to put it out of my mind, figuring maybe he really had just spent it all on the funeral. But then, one weekend, while cleaning out some of Dad's things, I stumbled across a folder in Dad's old desk. Inside were some brochures and pricing lists from a few local funeral homes. One of the brochures was from the exact funeral home we'd used for Dad's service. Curiosity got the better of me, and I looked at the prices for their basic package, which was honestly all Dad would have wanted. He was a practical guy, never wanted a fuss or anything fancy. And according to that brochure, the basic package was nowhere near the amount Ray had claimed he spent. In fact, it was a fraction of it. My stomach twisted. I was starting to feel like I'd been duped. But maybe there were other charges. Maybe Ray had gone for some premium package, even if that didn't make sense for Dad. I decided to call the funeral home myself. I told them I was handling some final paperwork and needed a copy of the invoice for Dad's service. They emailed it to me within an hour. The total amount? $8,500. $8,500. I had to sit down. I'd been expecting maybe something around $20,000, maybe even $25,000 if Ray had added some extras. But $8,500? And Ray had said he'd nearly used up the full $40,000? He'd lied. There was no other way to put it. My own brother had lied, pocketed over $30,000, and made himself out to be some kind of hero in the process. I felt sick. Angry. Betrayed. I sat with this knowledge for a few days, just stewing, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just sit on this information, but I didn't want to blow up the family either. So I decided to confront Ray directly. I called him up, told him I needed to talk to him in person. He showed up at my place, looking a little nervous, which I guess should have been a red flag right there. I took a deep breath and told him I knew the truth about the funeral costs. I told him I'd seen the invoice, and I knew exactly how much he'd really spent. For a moment, he just stared at me, completely silent. Then, he started laughing, this forced, fake laugh. He tried to brush it off, saying I didn't understand how funeral costs worked, how there were all these hidden fees, and how the invoice I'd seen didn't show the full picture. But he wasn't fooling anyone. He was stammering, avoiding eye contact, and I could see he was trying to think up excuses on the spot. I asked him where the rest of the money went, and he just got defensive, accusing me of being petty and ungrateful for all the work he'd put into the funeral. I told him straight up, Ray, Dad would never have wanted this. He wouldn't want you lying to us, especially about something like this. That's when he lost it. He went on a tirade about how he needed the money more than anyone else, how he'd been struggling with bills, and how he deserved a bit of help. He even tried to guilt trip me, saying I didn't understand how hard his life had been lately. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our dad's life insurance payout was supposed to support the family, not bail Ray out of his poor decisions. I was furious, but I didn't want to make things worse, so I told him we'd talk later and showed him the door. But I knew there was one more person who needed to know the truth, our mom. Ray had always been her favorite, and I knew this was going to hurt her, but I couldn't keep it a secret. This wasn't just some little white lie. This was Dad's legacy, and Ray had stolen from it. I took the invoice and all the documents I'd found, and I went over to Mom's house. I sat her down, showed her everything, and explained what had happened. She was silent the entire time, just looking at the papers with this blank expression. When I finished, she didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me." I could see the heartbreak in her eyes, though. She couldn't believe that her own son, her golden boy, would do something so low. She asked me to leave her alone for a bit, and I could tell she was processing it all in her own way. The fallout from that conversation. A few days after I told Mom everything, Ray called me again. This time, he was frantic. I could hear it in his voice that something had happened. Turns out, Mom had confronted him, and she didn't hold back. She demanded he pay back every dollar of what he'd taken. She wanted a full explanation of why he thought he could steal from Dad's legacy and lie to his family. But Ray, true to his nature, doubled down on his story, claiming we didn't understand his situation. He even tried to spin it, saying he'd done us a favor by taking on all the stress of handling the funeral. But Mom didn't buy it. She'd had enough. After Ray refused to pay anything back, Mom made a decision. She went to her lawyer and cut Ray out of her will completely. She told me she couldn't, in good conscience, leave anything to a son who would steal from his own family and use our father's death to line his pockets. And she didn't stop there. See, my mom's a strong woman. She decided to tell everyone in the family what Ray had done. She laid it all out, no details spared. I didn't know how they'd react, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. The rest of the family was furious. People who had trusted Ray, who thought he was a stand-up guy, turned their backs on him. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all cut him off. But here's where it got interesting. Ray had been borrowing money from various family members over the years, always with promises to pay them back. Most people didn't know he'd been doing this with multiple people. But once Mom told everyone the truth, they started talking to each other, realizing he'd lied to all of them, too. They saw he'd been using them as a safety net, just like he used Dad's life insurance. Pretty soon, Ray was the family outcast. He tried calling me, texting, sending messages, but I didn't respond. The family had decided that until he paid back the funeral money he'd taken and apologized to everyone he'd lied to, he was done. A couple of weeks later, Ray showed up at my door, looking worn down and desperate. He begged me to talk to Mom, to tell her he'd changed and seen the error of his ways. He even offered to pay back some of the money in installments, saying he'd work hard to make it right. I stood there, watching him try to play the same manipulative games he'd always played, and I realized something. He hadn't changed. He was just scared because he'd finally been caught. So I told him the truth. I told him he'd broken our trust, and that trust wasn't something he could buy back with apologies or empty promises. I told him he was getting what he deserved and that until he made things right, I had nothing else to say to him. As a final act of closure, I went to Dad's grave later that week. I told him everything, and while I don't know if he could hear me, I felt a kind of peace knowing that Ray couldn't take advantage of his memory anymore. Dad's hard-earned money would stay where it was supposed to, with the people who actually cared about him and respected his legacy. Ray moved to a different city soon after, and we rarely hear from him. He's basically disappeared from the family, and we don't feel his absence. Mom's still strong, and she says she's finally at peace knowing the truth came out. Ray thought he could cheat us all, thought he was smarter than the rest of us. In the end, he lost everything. And honestly, I don't feel bad for him one bit.